5. Restless. I awoke, as so often drunk with sleep, and perhaps the last vestiges of whatever I had inhaled in the crag, to a sharp pain in my calf. I was quickly roused, and jostled a span of the gravel which hemmed me in loose, letting light pour into my sleeping cubby. There was something shiny and chitinous fastened to my leg, I saw, though it remained wholly still until I sidled out into the light and made to remove it. While I slept, a centipede several feet long had crawled in after me, perhaps seeking its own hiding place. But finding a ready store of meat sleeping soundly within, it had coiled itself around my lower leg and planted its jaws in the flesh. Shock gave me speed in finding the rusty, broken knife I'd been given, and with some effort I cut the thing's head off as it thrashed around, never once letting loose. But once it had been decapitated, the head itself still didn't let up, and had to be plucked and carefully sliced out of the skin, mostly with the help of the obsidian shard. The head had been almost entirely buried in the meat of my leg, and the hole the removal left on the back of my calf was nearly 3 inches wide. I suppose now, in retrospect, the thing must have had some venom about it that numbed the area it was dining on, for I felt little throughout the ordeal. But I did know that the sodden air of the jungle chambers would eventually cause problems, as it so often did for men who fought Indians down in Florida. So, I spent over an hour making a small fire among a cluster of nearly dry leaves or fronds of some green fungus along the wall, feeding it with hastily gathered fuel, until I had heated the end of a long stone enough to burn the skin. I then singed the wound as best I could, and made to go. The interlude with the centipede was one among many. I swatted a long, shrimp-like bug that had silently landed on my neck away to find it had left a dense, itching bump behind after whatever feeding it had done. I found that I had to scratch around inside my ears regularly to disrupt the swarms of tiny black gnats that congregated within, their vibrations drowning out the sound of the fungal forest all about me. The rocky edges of the chambers were slick with the excretions of a sort of gigantic snail that dwelt along the roof, descending on occasion to find water or supplement food on the jungle floor, and though none troubled me, I certainly stumbled more than once when I failed to pick out their slime trails in the omnipresent damp. And at each stirring in the fungal fronds about me, I missed sorely the hammer I had dropped, and clutched tight the tiny obsidian knife I carried. All this prevented me from ever truly becoming confident or comfortable in my new surroundings. As I picked my way through chamber after chamber, some smaller and some larger, but all teeming with life and color and the sounds of living and dying, I was ever reminded that I had no place in all that chaos, and that my continued existence within the tangle relied as much upon good fortune as it did on any resourcefulness of mine. When 6 or 8 hours saw me prematurely exhausted, and I bedded down beneath a rock overhang at the terminus of a miles-long, thin expanse of jungle chamber that seemed to have no exit, I was spent. The gouge on my leg that the centipede had wrought had begun to throb hours earlier, and after days on the move over unforgiving and slick stone, my many near falls and awkward footsteps had left my limbs sore and trembling. I'm certain the blood-sucking flyers of the forest didn't help matters either. But I had a fresh mushroom cap taken from the village back in the lake chamber to start a roaring fire beneath the more porous and flammable chunks of fungal trunks and caked lichen I could gather from the misty eaves of the glowing forest, and before long I was drying my stockings and warming my battered feet before a stone fire pit that radiated a toasty warmth which was at odds with my surroundings. Countless fires on our trip westward had inured me to lighting in difficult conditions, and to eating less than stellar feed. Today's feed was one of the woodlice from the forest floor which strayed too close to the edge of the foliage, the killing of which was a grueling endeavor after I managed to flip it over, as my small knife had trouble dispatching it once it was curled into a protective ball. But, after many clumsy cuts and a bludgeoning with a large, sharp stone, the young piglet-sized woodlouse was dead, and I prepared it in much the same way I had the crawlers from the lake chamber. I propped the beast low over my fire upon 2 flat stacks of shale and fallen stone, still in its carapace shell. The smell of it was not pleasant, but it was also not unpleasant, and I caught no whiff of foul rot or poisonous tang on the air. It was, as with so much food down here, an earthen smell, of upturned soil beneath old stumps. Like the shellfish crawlers, I let the overgrown woodlouse sit for a long while to ensure most of the moisture was cooked out of it, and to hopefully permit whatever I didn't immediately eat to keep a bit longer as the time in this tangled mire of moisture and fungal decay marched ever onward. When, after hours of being rotated over the well-fed flame, I finally removed the leg segments and tested a chunk from one of the ends, I found it less rubbery than the lake chamber crawlers had been, and devoured every ounce I could stomach. I would pause whenever I felt filled to bursting, and sit languidly until I felt able to eat once more. Then, warming the thing upon the fire all the while, I would cut into its soft underside again, and gorge until I felt on the verge of illness. But hungry as exhaustion and the hopeless hostility of my surroundings had made me, I could not finish the beast over the course of what I thought to be an afternoon, and some more salient part of my mind doused the flame of my animalistic need to eat until I burst. I buried the half-corpse that remained beneath a bank of the sharp gravel which so often hugged the banks of runoff streams and overhangs along the forest chamber walls as a measure of protection, and then bedded down for an early rest on the cool stone, with a sizable pile of the alien fungal fuel nearby to feed the fire should I wake up and find it wanting. I was so ragged by that point that sleep was easy despite the strange environment and uncomfortable position on unforgiving ground, but some time after my near-immediate fall into unconscious oblivion, I cannot be sure exactly how long, but it couldn't have been much more than an hour, there sounded a rustling and stirring in the dense growth down the stony and moss-eaten embankment that separated my camp from the gleaming gauntlet of flora. I woke immediately, gifted the alertness of a wild beast by my days on the move, and looked down into the tangle, my eyes watering with the strain of trying to discern shapes amidst the luminescent jungle. The first thing I registered was movement among the alien scrub. It swayed and bristled with disturbance here and there, and it was evident to my eyes after so long spent watching it for potential assaults during my trips through the jungle chambers that there were things lurking at the forest's edge. There was a clicking and shuffling, as of many pointed legs thumping stone. Flashes of orange and red were seen now and then as vibrant shelled bodies writhed and scuttled in the murk. What these things were, I did not yet know, but I would not have to wonder for long. One emerged at first, tentative and measured in its movements. It was a great, round terrestrial crab, standing perhaps knee-height on a man, but with a thick and at points serrated armored shell upon its back that stood far taller. Its black eyes watched as I tried to remain absolutely still, and its forelegs plucked and swiped at the stalks, as if cleaning the orbs for a clearer view. The thing's claws, one shriveled and one bloated, stirred beneath it, and clacked slowly as it observed. The noise of the jungle about me had died away slightly, I realized then, for barring the echoed thrum of running water, I heard no beasts save the crab thing and his still-hidden fellows in the densest stretches of foliage. Now the others emerged, first making 6, and then 12, and before long, several dozen sets of beady eyes watched on from the shadows beneath the fungal fronds and gleaming mushroom trees. The light of my near-dead fire pit was between us, and though the chamber was well lit, it seemed something about the open embers troubled or deterred them. But I had no guarantee such a situation would last. After several long moments spent in silent, icy consideration, I rolled slowly onto my back and sat up, my obsidian shard gripped in my hand pathetically, as if that would prove useful. The beasts remained in place, though I saw their twitching grew more agitated and unpredictable than before. Still careful not to move too suddenly or appear active and awake, I carefully slid my left hand up along the ground to where my jacket pack had served as a pillow and swept it up under one arm. With my right, I leaned out to where my half-eaten woodlouse was buried in the gravel and clumsily sank my hand there until I felt the singed shell and could flip it out of its burrow. Still the things watched, some large as the first, others stunted as household cats. Occasionally, one would take a tentative step forward, only to dart back 2 or 3, seeking the security of the ranks behind it. The clacking of claws grew bolder, and even more were poking forth from the fungal fronds now, adding their weight to the slipshod formation of crustaceans. I knew what I had to do. The only escape was up the rough-hewn slick rock of the cliff behind me. Such a climb was not impossible, but the moisture and clingy growth upon the stone would make it more than a bit risky. Moreover, it seemed impossible that the things looking on from the eaves of the forest would prove incapable of skittering spider-like up the wall in my wake. But I could not kill or maim them all, and as I tugged my woodlouse prize, perhaps the thing which had drawn them to my camp in the first place, and fastened my jacket pack about my neck, I struggled to discern how I would ascend with my food in tow. First, my thought was to leave it. Perhaps that was all the things wanted, and they would drag it back into the trees. But the silence of the fungal wood told me these things were not merely scavengers. The jungle would not have fallen into frigid quiet for pickers of bones. These were pack animals of a sort, I knew, even if their skittish minds were more insectile than those of coyotes or wolves. Still, I rolled the scarred woodlouse shell downhill towards the things as I backed slowly for the cliff behind, anything to slow or dissuade a pursuit. But the gamble immediately proved fruitless, for 2 of the smaller creatures greedily dragged the meat into the fungal morass behind them, and only a handful of the more alert specimens followed them in to dine. The rest continued their vigil. If anything, their trial runs forward grew more bold, and their twitching grew more eager, their angular bodies backlit eerily by the glowing forest floor they ruled. I had only gotten about 5 or 6 feet back from the fire pit when the largest of the beasts charged in earnest, and the others followed suit. I was caught then between 2 choices, neither promising. The first was to immediately flee up the cliff face, and trust the things would not catch me low, or, failing, follow me up. But this left too much to chance, and even in the split second I had to consider my options, I leaned the other way. The second, more wasteful, and perhaps riskier choice, one I had mulled over since seeing the first of the beasts vomited forth from the fronds, was what I chose. I had palmed the powder horn in my jacket pack during my rise, and had ensured it was on top of the pile. I slid the horn with a precision that must have been granted me by terror and need alone from its perch over my shoulder, and popped off the cap in one fluid motion. I then tossed the full contents of it in a thick cloud towards the fire pit, where embers still simmered, and turned my head away. I didn't watch whatever brief flare of light and crackling fire ensued. I know it badly singed the hand which had gripped the horn and some of my hair. something I realized only later, when the rush of the situation had abated, which suggests the flare of ignition was hot and bright. But dispersed as it was, there was little concussive force, and no shrapnel or thumping blast followed the ignition. Rather, the cloud of powder crackled loud and fierce, making a shrill series of pops and sizzling sparks that still hopped upon the floor when my eyes opened, and I made good my escape up the rough wall. The ignition had taken hold as the first of the crabs neared the pit, and though it is unlikely any were actually harmed, the echoing noise of the cloudburst and the sudden appearance of the flash and smoke that followed had the effect I had gambled for. The beasts were all gone when I looked back over one shoulder, hiding, just out of sight, on the eaves of the woodland. They watched on as I found my first handhold and began the clamber up, slipping and jolting but keeping firm on the sharp edges all the while. I knew even then their retreat was not permanent, and even as I crested the first ridge and came to a steep incline that proved less treacherous than the sheer drop of before, I saw that they were testing the open ground again, as if to see whether another blast would follow. But, obviously, no more were forthcoming. I crested the next incline and then came to a tiered sort of natural staircase and began to hoist myself up from Titan step to Titan step, each small rise along the wall feeling more like delay than victory. I had done this almost 5 times by the moment the largest crab thing hit the wall, its fellows in close pursuit. I crested the final step and leapt for another ledge down the way, almost sliding off with the force of the landing as I came back to ground. A look down told me the small ones could navigate the cliffs better than the big ones, but still, all were making progress. I climbed up another sheer wall of blessedly broken and asymmetrical rock, straining nails and bloodying palms in the process. Every scaled tree or climbed wall recalled from childhood had done little to prepare me for this, and my shoulders and back and arms ached with the strain of an already exhausted frame pushed to the very limits of exertion. All the while, the clacking grew closer. No calls came up from the hunters, and no coordination, at least that I could perceive, was undertaken. Some fell, with the largest of their number toppling from the steps I had ascended, and seeming to lull injured or stunned at the cliff bottom. But the swarm was not deterred, and continued its tidal rise up the cavern wall, with a single-minded determination to eat. I came into a thick band of the mist that hung in the middle heights of the jungle chamber, and for a time I was blind to any stone more than a few feet before me, and had to lunge and grope in the haze for holds. The rocks were wet, and my hands had grown numb and stiff, as if frozen in the silhouette of hooks. Now and then I kicked smaller and nimbler crabs which came forth from the fog to nip at my boots back down the incline, and heard them clatter as they struck stone on the long way down. I emerged, gasping and nearing the edge of absolute devastation, to look out over a cloudscape of roiling mist and moisture which thrummed with the wings of flocking insects and swooping bats, amidst spires of fungal flesh whose caps glowed like suns overhead. The roof of great columns and inverted spires of stone was hundreds of feet up still, and in those scant seconds I was absorbed by the sheer stupid brilliance of my newfound surroundings. I glimpsed distant falls on far walls, and rainbows wrought by the wet atmosphere of the vast room. It was actually raining across the way, miles distant, the confined space having developed its own weather. But here too were the shadows of giants astride the windless air, for from the stalactite forest which reigned on the ceiling, certain somethings with a wingspan of 20 or 30 feet occasionally swooped from the shadow to snatch giant dragonflies and return to their unseen perches. I hung shocked in place for a few scant seconds, and then, kicking at another pursuer which welled up from the mist behind me, was forced by the close pursuit to move on. But I was losing ground, as I'm certain I had been all along. Especially now, with the failure of my battered body looming large, I could not push much longer. So it was that when I hoisted myself up onto what I thought was a ledge to find I'd crawled into a great, deep, horizontal crack in the side of the jungle chamber, and saw a space to stand and move in the fissure, I took my chance and settled in to do what I could to defend myself. I drew my pathetic obsidian shard once more, and backed slowly away from the edge of the fissure into the gloom that reigned within. When the first of the crabs crested the edge, though, they were snatched from the stone by the same winged giants that I had glimpsed harrying the dragonflies. They were vast bats, fox-headed and cunning, which sung to one another on the hunt. There was a strange linguistic element to their chatter, something almost akin to alien languages among Indians or foreigners, nuanced and lilting and rapid. Perhaps they had been coming for me, and my retreat into the gloom of the crevice had spared me their attentions. But I counted my blessings regardless, as I still count them, for the winged giants broke the momentum of the crustacean charge, and I saw no more crest the ledge after the first ranks were taken. I almost sat down and caught my ragged breath. The pursuit had bludgeoned my willpower more totally than any struggle I'd yet seen, and part of me wanted to collapse into sulking rest. But I was in the dark again, and even as I felt the relief of escape, I reminded myself nowhere was safe in this underworld until I ensured it to be so. Thus, I stood taller and squinted into the shadow about me, looking this way and that down the length of the vast fissure in which I stood. The floor was near perfect, as was the ceiling. Whatever geological conspiracy had brought about this gap in the wall had made it clean, and had torn from one end of the jungle cavern to the other like a knife through wet clay. It was more than a mile across, but the gap itself was no taller from floor to roof than 10 or 12 feet at most, narrowing off near the distant edges. It reached deep into the stone, seeming to descend slightly as it went from where I stood near the brink, and there was light far away as the fissure seemingly broke into another chamber beyond, 100 yards off at most. But the most alarming feature of the crevice stole any relief I might have felt at seeing an exit, for hazy obstructions blocked the light here and there. At first I took these to be foliage, but as I tentatively pressed a few feet in to attempt a better look at the distant light beyond, I saw that they were webs, much like the ones I had glimpsed in earlier chambers. They spanned the brief height of the fissure, and strands of them formed columns and haphazard bands like spittle in an open mouth. Dead dragonflies and softly glittering darters from the air of the broader jungle cavern hung still and stayed within them, and a strange, alchemical smell hung about the air, not hazy or poisoned as with the riverside gorge, and not quite rotten, but rather conjuring to mind the musky and desiccated innards of abandoned homes, old tomes, and ancient bones. I saw no spiders to accompany the webs, whether on floor or ceiling, but much as part of me wished to light my sole remaining and half-burnt candle in an attempt to see creeping doom in the dark, I thought better of it. I saw no hunter nearby, and given the sheer scale of the crevice, I might hope to pass through unseen and undetected, so long as I didn't stumble headfirst into a web and die like some ignominious insect. I fought back my fear and exhaustion, stayed my trembling hands as I adjusted my pack, and gripped tight my obsidian as I pushed towards the soft, cold light visible through the open mouth of the fissure, praying with each step that I did not have to use it to cut myself desperately free. The gentle reflection of shiny silk was the saving grace of my shadowy walk. if one was careful and strained their eyes long enough over each span of open stone, little hints of glints in the dark would betray lone strands or wires in the gloom. Though I doubt even now single threads could hold or bind a grown man, they might alert still lurkers hidden from sight to a trespasser's presence. Each inch I crept forward was haunted by memories of a large golden garden spider, which had kept its intricate web near my parents' woodpile one summer when I was small, and the speed with which it had darted to see to new arrivals made my blood run cold as the image was transcribed onto the situation at hand. My paranoid care was enough, though, despite my worry. I emerged from the other end without glimpsing a lurking crawler in the fissure. My lone picture of the eight-legged beasts, which dwelt therein, came just as I reached the far edge, as I caught motion far off to my side on the wall of the Newfound Cavern. There, a great spider hauled itself back up from some browse or hunt below to take shelter on high. It was a black and shiny thing, fat like a tarantula, but with sleek armor free of hair. But the details were lost on me, and it passed into the shadow of another portion of the fissure nearly a mile distant. I thanked heaven for my safe passage, but simultaneously never let my senses dull to what was behind me as I drank in my new surroundings. I stood far up on the wall of the chamber, perhaps 80 feet from the ground. The new cavern I overlooked was another like the lake chamber into which I had fallen at the start of my escape. But this had the near-unbelievable scale of the jungle chambers about it, and the stone shores of it boasted small outcrops of gleaming moss and cold-colored fungal forest, which chilled me with thoughts of the toxic air and awful slugs of the low crag in which I had almost met my sleepy end. The depths were more alive than ever with the glint of aquatic flora and fauna, and the waters were so vast that they lapped and bobbed like the surface of a calm sea, perhaps disturbed by vents and currents from below. It was far brighter than the first lake chamber, and far dimmer than the jungle had been. But this was welcome, for my eyes had begun to ache with the sheer agonizing gleam of the prior rooms, and like a man going snowblind, I had begun to yearn for darker climes once more. I picked my way down to even ground at the water's level relatively easily, for the walls were less steep and cliff-like here, and once I could stand without worry over slick moss or clinging web, I sat down near the shore and drank deep, careful to watch for motion in the water as I did so, and granting the pale fungal copses scattered along the shore a wide berth. I had worried the water might be salty. So gigantic and so deep was the pool that I must on some level have associated it with the sea and worried that it might be undrinkable. But such things are apparently rare underground, and it was as clear and fresh as the first pools had been. Indeed, based upon what I would later learn, it is wholly possible the two are connected, for great sunken tunnels and channels of teeming and deadly underground water link many of these vast lakes in the region. In the moment, though, I just enjoyed the drink, and felt my heart rate at last descend into a normal and steady rhythm. But relief gave way to nagging worry. I was out in the open on the shore, and there were no obvious breaks along the distant shoreline that indicated ruins or outposts on the edge of the cavern. The far sides of the lake were obscured by distance, mist, and occasionally monstrous natural columns of rough stone, which rose from the depths to hold aloft the ceiling. With no way of knowing what hunted along the shore, and with memories of the browsing spider I had seen returning to the crevice fresh in my memory, I resolved to walk the unforgiving beach and see what I could see before I relented to the sleep my body cried out for. I turned right, a decision made more because the nearby land seemed less ragged than because of any set goal I had, and began to trace the shore, winding outward towards the wall to steer clear of any pale mushroom groves when they drew too near. Guano and the mud of rotten life collected in slick piles along the low crooks in the floor, and the lobster things thrived here. I stomped too as I went, and bundled them into my pack, relieved I would not go long without food. Though I kept my eyes skyward, thinking of the vast bats of the jungle chamber behind me, I saw only more regular specimens break the glittering panoply of quartz clouds above, and the terrible wasps and bloodsuckers and gnats of the prior caverns seemed gracefully absent. The still air was stirred by no distant waterfall, and with the noise of the jungle chamber strangled by distance, I was immersed in a quiet which allowed me to hear my own footsteps, and perhaps better order my own tired thoughts, for the first time in days. I reflected upon the savage chance which had brought me there to that sunless lakeshore, and as a mile slipped past without sign of danger, my thoughts came to truly rest at home for the first time since making my leap. I wondered how long had passed since I had left the light of the overworld, and wished to know what was going on along the boring streets of Richmond I had left so gladly behind me. The childish warmth of home seemed less terrible and suffocating now, when I was confined miles and miles below ground, with seemingly endless expanses of hostile ground all about me. But this eventually became an exercise in exhaustion, and as the second and third mile came and went, more primitive parts of my mind must have drowned it out as my steps came slower and wistful sorrow overcame me. Soon my concerns were again purely animal, and it is only now in reflection that I can summon up those distant thoughts of a lost and far-off home. A coiled millipede many dozens of feet long frightened me as it rose up to observe my passing from a cluster of fungal fronds up the wall, but otherwise the walk was uneventful. The water off to my side was alive with flickers of light and submerged motion, and fish teemed even in the shallows of the pool, but none troubled or startled me, and I tried my best not to look off into the deeper reaches, lest I see disturbing things there. But the fourth mile saw me glimpse a sort of cube of polished stone further along the shore, and as the fourth ended and the fifth began, I made out that it was studded with several window apertures unmistakably like those of the buildings I had witnessed in prior settlements of the stone giants. This was a hut or shack by comparison, perhaps 20 feet to a side, dwarfed by the large interconnected compounds of prior outposts, and standing isolated and alone. Yet, much as it bucked tradition, the simple reliefs and symbols along its flanks left no doubt as to its construction. Reflecting now, it floors me that I approached so casually. I can lean on the excuse that I was ragged and exhausted, but even in that state, the omnipresent threat of danger down in these caverns should have granted me more sense than I had. But the dwelling was dark as any I'd seen before, and as I drew near, I saw no movement or stirring which spoke to life within, whether it be by twisted humanoids or some other denizen of the cavern. I approached without worry, and though I stayed quiet as I ever was, I did not trouble to remain unseen. There was an old and battered thing beached along the gravel of the shore that I correctly took to be an aged, hollowed-out carapace of some mighty insect, intended for use as a canoe. I rounded the small, single-floor dwelling and saw no entrances save one, a shallow round door facing the lake that seemed built for visitors to crawl through, but which was not sloped or slick as so many others in the city chambers had been. The barren interior glimpsed through this door was of angular seats and low tables and unadorned sleeping cubbies of flat stone, carved into the natural floor with unparalleled grace. Its walls, save for the viewing ports which allowed the low light of the rest of the chamber to slip in, were unadorned, and its whole space was empty, I looked along the shore the way I had come, and saw nothing. I looked along the shore further along my way, and was met with the same vacancy. My eyes heavy and my limbs leaden, I ducked into the building I took to be derelict, ensured it was empty of any lurking beasts or telltale droppings, and then bedded down in the sleeping cubby that occupied the back corner. With my prior sleep having been interrupted, and the ensuing escape having proven so harrowing, I did not linger in thoughtful wakefulness more than a moment before slipping into sleep. But when eventually I woke, I would come to curse my slothful carelessness.